Voices from the Mausoleum is brought to you by the You Run Podcast Network and yourunpodcast.com. Be sure to check out the Girl and the Gay podcast, a bi-monthly podcast where Beck and Jay discuss their favorite movies, available on Apple Podcasts. And a very special thank you to our Patreon subscribers.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Voices from the Mausoleum, and welcome to another indie horror author interview. This time, we are joined by Joshua Millican, who is somebody I connected with on Twitter, was very kind and sent us an e-arc for this. We did have to reschedule because, as everybody knows, my June was a little chaotic, and it's been very difficult to do anything lately. But we are finally here to talk about his newest release, which actually originally came out June 25th, but that's Teleportasm. Teleportasm.
Mm-hmm. You got it.
He did a trip over.
Well, I always second guess myself when I say things out loud I don't normally say out loud. But yeah, so I'm just going to give you a brief description about Joshua's history with writing, and then we'll jump into some stuff specific to Teleportasm. So what started as a personal blog back in 2011 quickly turned into more as Joshua moved into writing for other sites. Ending up at Dread Central in 2016, he went on to being editor-in-chief from 2019 to 2021. Very cool. The host of talk show Chronic Horror, which got sidelined during the pandemic. He explored the subject matter of horror fandom and cannabis culture. Working with pubs such as, this one is such a hard word for me to say, Encyclopocalypse.
You got it.
All right. And Shortwave, which I do know. I'm super familiar with Shortwave. Joshua has put out other titles such as The Dreadful Years, which is a collection. Forbidden Zone, the novelization, also super cool. Septum, Deeper Than Hell, and now Teleportasm.
That's right.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of just want to start with let's talk about the cover first, and then we'll kind of jump into some more like storyline stuff. But yeah, tell us about this cool cover.
Well, Mark Volchek did the cover for the first two books in the Killer VHS series as well. He's just really got the vibe nailed, the vibe being that classic VHS era. Yeah. And the nostalgia that comes with it. The idea was something that Shortwave Publishing founder and Killer VHS series mastermind Alan Listuvka, it's something we kind of came up with together. Teleportasm is kind of like my love letter to analog body horror. So we thought about Videodrome and that had that kind of feel. And he came up with this idea of a stacked bank of television sets with body parts scattered all over them. And Mark Volchek is such a talented artist. It looks like a VHS, but it also, the color palette of this is just amazing. It looks like you're looking at it under a black light, even though you aren't. And it's funny, I was so blown away by this cover that I actually went back and changed the color palette of Teleportasm to match the cover. There's a lot of smoke in Teleportasm, as you guys know. And originally it was green to sort of match the green fog of the Philadelphia Experiment, which was one of the influences. But I went back and I turned it all to purples and aquas and things like that to match the cover because I was so inspired by this. I wanted the insides to match the outsides.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the cover is so eye-catching. Like you can't see this and not pay attention to it. Like it's stunning. They did a great job. And I actually have not read any of the other Killer VHS books, but it's obviously intended now because I really enjoyed this one. But yeah, that cover, I love it. The purple blues together like that, I'm here for it.
Yeah, you sell a poster print of this cover because that.
Maybe we should, right? If I ever,
I think you guys should. It is really catching.
It is.
Thank you. And the next book in the Killer VHS series was designed by Alan Listuvka, but then there's some more titles coming up, and Mark's back for those. There's going to be a sequel to what was the second release, Candy King Kills, coming out in December, and I've seen the art for that. I think it's been released. You can find it on the internet.
Yeah, it has. Yep, I've seen it.
It's just amazing. It has like this stained glass element to it, and the villain of that is hopefully soon to be very iconic Christmas slasher who just looks fantastic. But these covers are amazing, and it's been one of the pleasures of being part of the Killer VHS series was being able to collaborate on something like this with such a talented designer in Alan and a talented artist in Mark.
Yeah. Just sort of riffing off of that question, what do you feel like goes into making like a successful sort of cover for a book? Like what sort of how would you sort of categorize a good solid like novel cover?
Well, I think at this point, people need to move away from, I hate to say it, but the prefab looking design. There are a lot of the semi-photo realistic faces being featured over a scary backdrop. And I think that's just, it's time to kind of like move away from that. I think that something two-dimensional is really eye-catching. It can accentuate the letters, the title, as much as the vibe. I think it just kind of depends. But it's also great when you feel like you've just really gotten an insight into the book that's specific, something beyond just, this is going to be dreadful or haunting or gothic, something that's going to be like, oh, this is going to be a little different, or this is going to be a little fun, or it's going to be a little uncomfortable even.
Yeah, right. Yeah, something that's going to sort of like etch into like the potential reader's brain, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, I think that this one does that very well, because it's very like, and I'll be honest with you, I do agree with the face thing. Like, I do see that those are not things that speak to me really, but I think that I also am such a big fan of like bright horror things that are just because there's so much black and red, right? And there's nothing against black and red. It works. It totally works.
Well, but black and red is the color palette of horror. I mean, that's the shorthand of visual horror is black and red.
Yeah. And so I'm like, give me purple. I'm good with pink. I'm good with like, obviously lime green. I'm a fan of that. Like, but like, the bright stuff. Cause like all my horror shirts are black. And I'm like, no, like I want a pink horror shirt with like something crazy on the front of it. Like, and I like, these bright colors like this on covers immediately pull me in to be like, oh, let me go see what this is about. That's
the guys at Ghoulish do some really great covers too. Yep. Max Booth the Third. I just remember the cover for Maggot Screaming. I was just like, I don't know what this is going on. A mix of the title and the art for that, where I was just like, WTF, Max, what have you done here? And it's another kind of like bright, vibrant, two-dimensional cover like we're talking about.
Yeah. No, it is. Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, I totally agree. So when getting to do the third installment of the Killer VHS series, kind of just wanted to ask like how that worked out, like just getting into working with Shortwave for this book, and like, because I know like obviously it's a series, so it's different and it's different authors, but just kind of your own experience and getting to do the project.
Well, a lot of it has to do with luck. Sometimes just being in the right place in the right time is what it takes. Brian McCauley, who wrote Candy King Kills, he and I are in the same chapter of the Los Angeles Horror Association, the Los Angeles chapter. He moved away, unfortunately. I miss him. But, this is like 3 years ago now. We were both new kids on the block who had just published first novels, and I was like, oh, what are you working on? He's like, I'm working on Killer VHS series. And I'd heard about the Killer VHS series through Twitter. Twitter is actually a surprisingly vibrant community for indie publishing. I found, a lot of people have moved on to other platforms, but Twitter is really kind of where it's at for indie publishing. So I had heard of Killer VHS, and I was like, man, I would love to get on board with that. And he was like, well, send Alan an email. So I actually thought up the pitch just for this.
Okay, that's cool. This
wasn't something I had planned out beforehand. And, being the third one to come in had its own challenges that turned out to be just some of the biggest joys of the process. Because if you've read any of my other books, Deeper Than Hell and Septum specifically, they're very dark. There's a very brooding tone throughout. It's almost punishing. Not in terms of that it's a punishment to read it, but that it's the characters.
I hope you wouldn't say that about your own story.
Sure.
I mean, you can read the reviews for yourself. It's hardcore, but it's with Killer VHS though. There's an established tone already. Kind of the same way when you're talking about a film franchise. If you're coming in to be the director of Scream Part 3. Or Saw Part 3, there are things that you have to take into account beforehand. Whenever you try to pull a fast one, people are like, oh, we want the classic thing, So that's where Alan and I really had to work closely. And I liked it. The first draft I turned into him, he was like, not quite on point. He's like, I like it, but, I want this to be part of the Killer VHS series. And it was like, okay. Let's dial it back, a few steps. And, he and I worked together. I shared a lot of drafts with him where normally I wouldn't share drafts in an early stage. I was sharing very early drafts with him. And I was even running ideas past him before I even brought them through. I was even asking him questions about dialogue and things like that. I just had a random question. I'd give Alan a call. So, and he was always just so great to work with. So it was challenging at first. Like you said, coming in for Part 3, having to adjust my natural voice to something that I hadn't written before. But it was so much fun. And I'm so happy with what Teleportasm turned out to be. That, what started as a challenge just was one of the ultimate joys of the whole process.
Yeah. It's almost like challenging yourself with like a writer's prompt, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And even with the feedback I got that was sometimes negative, I tried not to take anything personally. We showed this to beta readers who actually had a direct influence on, how the story unfolded. And there were some times where I'd be like, oh, well, this person doesn't really see the point, or, I'm just going to ignore that comment. But then I would go back and I'd be like, okay, even if I don't necessarily agree with the comment, is this passage the best it can possibly be? Is there no room for improvement? Of course, that's not true, and I have to look at it and put myself in someone else's shoes. I just loved it. I loved having lots of people check it out, and I loved writing something that I wanted to appeal to as many people as possible.
Yeah.
But that said, Teleportasm is still gory AF. It's, you got to have
a body horror, right? Yeah, no, for sure.
It's not a mainstream book. We're getting called a modern day Goosebumps for adults, which is very apropos. This is R-rated. And I think Teleportasm is probably the most R-rated of the Killer VHS books so far. Brian McCauley can write some really gruesome kills as well, but I think I got him edged out at this point, but just a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's it does make you squirm a bit. I had not actually read any of the previous ones, so it'll be interesting for me sort of to go back.
I haven't read them either. Yeah.
You got to check them out. Really good stuff.
Yeah. So what has your experience been? I'm kind of like tweaking and adding things in here, Angel, so I apologize.
You're fine.
Inner flow. But how was your experience sort of since publishing Teleportasm been in terms of reader reception and getting the story out there? Obviously, going on doing interviews such as this, of course, but
it's been fantastic. The build up to it was a lot of fun in that we got to distribute e-arcs and physical advanced copies. So it was fun kind of generating a little bit of buzz before it was even released, got it into the hands of a lot of bookstagrammers and book talkers and things like that. Yeah. So it was just awesome, seeing that cover art everywhere and seeing the buzz build. And I think the response has been really fantastic. And it's a huge relief, to have people say another great installment in Killer VHS, because it has to be more than just a personal success. It has to be a team success for the whole franchise. So I've just been really happy with the feedback that I've been reading. I've been having a ton of fun going on podcasts like this, like you mentioned, when I'm working on it, I was only talking about it with Alan, and like to everyone else, I was just being vague and not getting into any details.
Yeah.
And then finally being able to talk about it with other people, explain the process. It's just been so much fun. I've really been enjoying being on podcasts to the point where I'm like, maybe I should start my own podcast.
Yeah.
It's been
Why not?
Absolutely a ton of fun. And at this point, now that the book's been out for a month, I'm ready to talk about spoilers. So when we dive into it, we can really get in the weeds, put everything on the table. But I had a great book signing at Dark Delicacies in Burbank. If you're from Southern California, you know that Dark Delicacies is a great independent bookstore / horror memorabilia place that does amazing signing events. They've been doing so for a couple of decades. So it was really wonderful to be able to have a signing event there. And hopefully I'll be doing some more events this fall. Nothing's set in stone, but I'm hoping to go back. Initial planning has already begun to do an event at my old college, UC Santa Cruz. I was a creative writing major there. So to be invited back to do something where I can actually show I was a creative writing major and now I'm a published author. And let me read you a chapter out of Teleportasm, because I think college age and above is definitely the target audience.
Yeah.
Anyways, if I'm going to go up to Northern California for that, I'd like to hit up a couple of other bookstores and try to make a little mini tour out of it. So if you follow me on Instagram or Twitter, you'll be able to know when those events come to fruition.
Yeah, very cool.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the sort of college being the target audience for this one. I feel like that's just sort of like that's when people, especially film students, they got the bong in the dorm room. They're probably finding Videodrome for the first time. Someone brought it up in a film class, right?
And that's the mindset I put myself back into to write Teleportasm. The through story, at least, I wanted it to be that kind of post-college time of your life where you're still kind of a kid, but things are about to get serious and you kind of don't have things figured out. So, I think people in college or just getting out of college are just going to devour this and really connect with it.
Yeah. I was going to read the synopsis and then we can kind of jump into some more
Sure, let's do it.
4 friends unearth a unique VHS tape that, when viewed, causes short distance teleportation with euphoric after effects, inadvertently launching a perilous trend. As copies of the original tape are made, the results become less predictable and ultimately gruesome due to analog generational decay. Despite the danger, some will risk everything for just one more trip.
Yes.
I'm always impressed. So writing the backs of books, right? The blurbs, right? Is to me, one of the hardest things to do. But whenever I read ones like this that so perfectly get you interested without giving too much away and cover the subject matter in such a vague way, I'm always super impressed, because I don't know how people do this shit where they take these really crazy, amazing, wild stories and they're able to get them down to these little tiny descriptions. But that's so great. That's so perfect for this story.
Thanks. Alan and I worked on that together, and you're right. And I think Teleportasm is a tough book to encapsulate because, as I'm sure we'll talk about very shortly, it's a pseudo anthology, almost like a mock anthology that seems to have a lot of standalone chapters.
Yes.
Which would be difficult to explain in a quick summary. So the synopsis really does a good job of saying okay, starts with 4 friends, but then it gets way, way out of hand.
Yeah. And we are really big found footage fans on this channel. We have an entire series dedicated to just found footage movies. And I in particular, it's like an addiction. It's my favorite subgenre. So reading through this and being a fan of found footage, I mean, you've already got the VHS element, right? And the stuff like that. But the way that you did it with the through story, like you mentioned before, and having these felt very VHS movie series to me, where they had this like, this
Absolutely.
overlapping story that is technically supposed to, and they don't always do it that great, but in this it connects very well. But it's supposed to connect all of these other random occurrences or stories. And I thought I actually didn't read. I didn't read the synopsis because I wanted to. I saw, because you were very thorough, and I appreciate it. You like sent me everything I needed to get ready for this, and
Nice.
I was like, no, I'm like not going to read this because I want to go in blind because I knew nothing about it. And so I was like, I'm going to go in. And so going into it that way and getting those nuanced like found footage things, or at least things that speak to me as found footage, I thought were so fun and super, super well done. That overall story and the way that it comes full circle in the end, like chef's kiss. That was great.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I would compare it to like a literary version of the VHS franchise.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very apropos.
Yeah. I thought it was great.
Well, I mean, let's dive into some of the sort of like the themes and the plot of this. I mean, sort of what came first, the chicken or the egg? Sort of like what was sort of the birth idea here in terms of like, did you want to tell a story about teleportation? Was it more about the substance focus? What was, or the particular experiment? Like what kind of became the corner, or the kind of sort of the first domino, I guess we'll say.
Sure. Yeah, I think the first domino was, like I said, when I met Brian, I thought about how cool it would be to be part of the Killer VHS series. And I thought about taking the concept of a Killer VHS literally and having the VHS be the villain or the embodiment of the antagonist, sort of like in the Ring franchise, the Ring movies. So I had seen some videos recently about a phenomenon called spontaneous teleportation, which is basically like people disappear and then you find them like dead, like stuffed between walls somewhere that they couldn't have possibly gone on their own. Just the idea, like spontaneous human combustion, you could go up in flames in no moment. Just the idea that you could, end up teleported, randomly because the universe is just crazy like that. So I took those ideas and I came up with this idea that I pitched to Alan as Hellraiser by way of the Philadelphia experiment, where the VHS tape was going to be like the lament configuration. Oh, cool. And it was all going to go back to, government experiments with teleportation, MK Ultra, Montauk, things like that. So that was kind of the first domino. Mm-hmm. But like I said, when I shared some of my initial writings with Alan, we had something that was really great, but really somber, and really intense. And we wanted something that was going to be more fun, like the Killer VHS series. So then it was like, okay, let's dial it back. Let's dial it way back. So one of the elements of my first draft was friendship, and kind of like friendships that get kind of splintered because of, other interests. Drugs potentially being one of those other interests. And I took some of the funniest moments from my first draft and I used those as the jumping off point. So then that's really how I got to the four stoners just hanging out, smoking bongs, talking about ways to get really, really high, because I liked the idea of, one of the images I had, one of the first dominoes was the idea of someone just finding this tape, sitting down in a chair to watching it, and then just kind of like falling back through the chair and just being like, what the fuck just happened? But like, you just drop through space a few feet. And then I really loved the idea of teleportation feeling good, because when you think about teleportation, even in the classic ways like Star Trek, you're beamed out and you turn into just these little sparkly bits of light, and then you come back. I was like, that has to feel good, right? That idea to the nth degree, to the idea that it feels orgasmic. All of a sudden you have teleportation as a drug, and it just became such a fertile playground. So I had this core idea, friendship, a group of friends, a splintering effect caused by the introduction of an X factor, so to speak. And then from there, I kind of threw all the ideas against a wall. So it's like, okay, teleportation, it's going to fuck you up, but it feels really good. Where's this going to go? And I threw all my ideas up, just made quick notes on everything. And then I kind of took the best ideas and developed them. And I found that, it worked wonderfully in this pseudo anthology setup, because I could have the core story of basically 4 friends who go out one night and oops, we fucked up the entire world, but they don't realize it at the time. So you've got this core story, and then you've got these jumps into the future, right, where you see the effects of these seemingly random decisions, this seemingly ubiquitous object. We're talking about a VHS tape that teleports across the room. It's like, what is that? Except that it feels really, really good, so you don't care what it is. You just want to do it over and over and over again. So it just became this wonderful playground, this sandbox for me to just play in with my shovels and my bucket, and Teleportasm evolved very organically.
Wow. That's, I think that actually one of the first things I picked up on was sort of the realness of the friendship and how real that felt, as far as like the characters, our initial 4, like interacting with each other, and just how like organic, I'll use that word again, organic that felt, because that carries the rest of to me, that helps all of the connecting pieces for the overall story, especially. And I know we'll talk about this when we get a little bit closer to the end, because it's the end of the book. But when we get to that last little scene before the epilogue, it's like all of that friendship stuff comes like full circle, and you're like, well,
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think that one of the things I felt I needed to ground Teleportasm, if it was going to be this wacky idea, if it was going to go to these really insane and gory places, I wanted it to have an emotional anchor. And I think I went the extra distance to initially I painted it with very broad strokes. These are just stoners hanging out, and giggling stoners in a basement, right? But then, by the end of the night they've had together, you realize, even though they don't know the full ramifications, everyone can feel that something profound has happened just in the course of one night. And then having it come very full circle at the end, with the reunion, it did feel kind of, it was emotional for me. And we'll talk more about it when we get there. But I feel really bad for what I did to Frankie, man. She didn't deserve it. She didn't deserve it. We'll just put it for now.
Yeah, we'll have. I mean, the story kicks off with sort of Lars's flashback and the whole story.
Yeah, to the experience before. Yeah.
Right. And that's really what kicks it off. What I thought was interesting was your first sort of segue from everyone's sort of desire to go and experience this for themselves was the flash to I think our ER nurses.
The nurse,
the nurse,
and sort of flashback. That's the only time we go back in time.
Yeah.
And so why start with the nurses as sort of our first side story? We'll say.
Sure. Well, I wanted the Philadelphia experiment lore to kind of be the jumping off point. So when most of your listeners, viewers probably are aware of the legend of the Philadelphia experiment, which is that during World War II, the government did these experiments where they teleported an entire ship. Well, they were just trying to turn it invisible, but they ended up sending this entire destroyer, teleporting it hundreds of miles away from a shipyard in Philadelphia to a shipyard in Virginia. It teleported back a few minutes later, and the really scary part is that a lot of the sailors had fused with the ship at a subatomic level. So the idea of people being stuck in walls, I think, is kind of like the core terror of teleportation as a concept. Yeah. So I wanted to be like, okay, Philadelphia experiment is going to be the jumping off point. We're going to be stuck in walls. And then I thought, this is a really difficult thing to kind of convince people of as a jumping off point. The fact that the Philadelphia experiment exists kind of as a cultural shorthand made it easier. But then I wanted to pull back even further. And instead of just describing what happened, I wanted it to be someone else explaining it to someone else. So instead of me having to convince you as a reader that this happened, I got to put it in someone else's hand, where it's just like, okay, someone is just trying to convince someone else, and I'm just the third person narrator.
I love that. Yeah.
That's cool. That's the way to put it.
So instead of talking about, okay, there was this accident where these 3 kids end up stuck in a wall, it unfolds as the an ER nurse who dealt with the aftermath just kind of decompressing after her shift by telling another nurse, "You won't believe what I saw last night." So,
and why does that make it so much more realistic? Like that way of telling it as a reader, you're just like, yeah, that happened. Like I think that was super smart to tell it that way. I hadn't really thought about it like that, honestly. Cause that's the next chapter. That's where we get
right. And that made it dialogue based as opposed to description based, which I think also makes it better for, potentially developing this into a movie or something too. I wanted to have these scenes that were based on dialogue where a lot of the most far-fetched elements were discussed as opposed to shown outright.
Tried to, yeah. That's a good point too. Yeah.
I could see this sort of being like a Shudder series. I'm just gonna say,
sure.
Yeah, Shudder, if you're watching,
That's right.
They have the VHS film series now.
This is definitely right up that alley. Yeah, for sure. I can definitely see this being especially like I will say, like, it's because I think exactly to what you just said, the way that this is written makes it very easy to visualize the segments as you're going through them, which I think would also make it a really interesting like film or series or parts or whatever. But
thank you. Yeah, a lot of basements, a lot of just rooms with people hashing it out. But in every situation, there's a much a larger context, a much, there are swirlings of a much larger universe, even in these situations that seem very self-contained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I wanted to touch too, at least more of just a general comment, I guess, but there are tons of music and horror movie references in this, things to the Twilight Zone and Vincent Price, and then you've got the segment with Ivy and Jasper, which is like super nostalgia, VHS store energy, right? Like these, and it was like reading the things or experiencing the things that were like part of what I grew up with, which I also thought was super cool. And I have to say this because I literally just covered this subject matter on conspiracy theories, is the note about the moon landing hints in The Shining. I died when I got to that part. Like I was reading it and I was like, no shit.
Yeah, it's definitely sprinkled with some really good conspiracy theories, and the Kubrick moon landing one. That was a fun Easter egg to plant, and I'm glad you found it.
Yeah, that was probably my favorite thing, like as far as like those kind of little things like that, because he's like talking about watching The Shining, right, and trying to find like, oh my God, I laughed so hard when I got to that part, and I was like, that is so great. I just had to tell you that. I love it.
Thank you so much.
I sort of love that you sort of ran with that stoner cliche of like sitting there and just going over conspiracy theories. I think that it gave the book fun, a lot of heart,
I mean, as much as I think the stoner cliches are two-dimensional. I'm part of cannabis culture. You mentioned I had a talk show for a while that dealt with cannabis culture, and I think most people would look at me and say, like, that guy probably dabbles in cannabis. If we're hanging out in person, you might get a contact high just standing next to me, but at the same time, I like kind of extrapolating on the stoner cliches because, beyond the giggles, I think stoners are very thoughtful, sensitive people, and before Cheech and Chong came on the scene, the idea of someone who smoked cannabis was a jazz musician or someone with like crazy, wild ideas, artists, and things like that. So I wanted to, kind of like start with, the tried and true, but, through the emotional journey and then with the reunion, showing that they were more than just stoners, that they were real people. And hopefully it goes beyond that. Even though I do indulge in those, I really indulge in those stereotypes, right? I just love them. But, you love them when they're true and when they're not thrown at you, with any sort of hostility, when it's sort of a celebration of the humor of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I thoroughly enjoyed Uncle Sal. And so it was just sort of the chat, when we get back to sort of our core group, and then they go to Uncle Sal's, and sort of what did you have someone in mind as you wrote this character?
I did. Have you ever seen that movie Extraterrestrials? It's like a 2010 sci-fi movie.
I haven't seen that.
I don't think so. That sounds like it's right up Angel's alley too. So.
Oh yeah, I love stuff like that. Yeah.
Michael Ironside plays a cannabis-growing conspiracy theorist, hermit, nut job. And Michael Ironside would be a little too old to play Uncle Sal in a remake. So I imagined a younger Michael Ironside, like a 40-year-old Michael Ironside. And basically, yeah, it could have been this character from Extraterrestrials. I think it's on Shudder. You should be able to find it, but yeah, it's really good.
Check that out. Yeah,
really good sci-fi. It's not found footage, but it uses a lot of those found footage tropes. So you'll definitely like it, and you'll see Michael Ironside playing this crazy ganja farmer conspiracy theorist, and that's Uncle Sal for you right there.
Yep.
That'll be good to have that in the back of my mind when I finally watch it.
Definitely.
I wanted to talk about some of the story elements that I thought that just like as I'm reading were just like that got me. And that's going to be starting with the chapter called Tila. So when we get to like the talk about like the creatures and stuff, like when they're talking about, I was like, wait, what? Like I must have reread that first like little chunk multiple times because I was like, I was not prepared for that. Because the one thing is true, and I think you actually touched on this a little bit earlier, Joshua, was that like there's a lot of this, I think, checks a lot of boxes. There's a lot of stuff in this that I think will appeal. Like, I think there's literally something for everybody. Like it covers, so many things. And so when I got to them talking about the creatures, I was like so uncomfortable. I was like, I do not care for that at all. But I really liked that the world, to me, that was when the world started, the issue and stuff started to feel much bigger. It was like, that's when you get the realization that like, this is really bad and it's affecting this in a bigger way, which led into the talking about the Knights of Penumbra. And I loved like this concept with that. And it kind of just runs the gamut on like viral sensationalism, like, and how these things spread and get stretched out and turn into all these things. And then you even go as far as to add, obviously, the CIA, FBI element to this, which I thought was just, and then I had to give props to this part too, where it talks about how they made fake videos to make the other videos look fake. I'm like, that's some real shit. Like that's some stuff that would happen. And so I'm like watching this, like, did this happen? Is this real? Like, it was such a cool moment. Once I got to that section of the story, I felt like that was when you really started, at least me as a reader, started to really understand that like this is a big issue. Like this is much bigger than just doing something for laughs or for fun or whatever with your friends. And I loved like how it amped up.
Yeah, you really nailed it. The chapter right before that, Welcome to Dead World, is where there's a big tonal shift. That's where it kind of goes from being something very funny and gross to being something like somber for a moment. And even though it gets funny and gross again, it's serious from that moment out, from the Tila chapter. And it's actually chronological from that moment out. There are no more there's no more going back to the core story after that. It's only what unfolds from there out. And I love that you mentioned, the fact that it threw you a loop with these creatures, because, like I was talking about before, I wanted the Philadelphia experiment to be the jumping off point. So with each new chapter, I actually felt a little bit of a desire to up the ante a little bit and to give people something new. And so I had already come up with the concept of, teleportation is going to be addictive. Teleportation as a drug. That's something that, that's a thread that starts being woven in very soon. But then, just the idea of like, how far can I take this? And the idea just pops into my head, teleportation zombies, right? Let's do it. Let's make teleportation zombies. And, I love the fact that, maybe when you first started reading it, you could be like, did I miss something? I thought this was I thought
Yes.
this was a low-tech sci-fi thing about
Yes.
teleportation. What are we talking about? These hordes of creatures running amok in these poor, rundown communities. What happened here? But then to have it eventually be explained how this is a side effect of habitual Tila use. Tila being the street name for teleportation.
Yeah.
So that's
love it.
Thank you. It was great for me to be able to just kind of like bust boundaries, at that point, like, let's go really wild. And the chapter after that you mentioned, the Knights of the Penumbra, that I felt was kind of the biggest risk of Teleportasm. And Alan and I talked about it, the publisher. That was not so much a tone shift, but a real genre shift at that point.
Yeah, that's true.
Because it goes straight up X-Files, Stranger Things, and it's like X-Files, Stranger Things are great, but this has been analog horror up until now. This has been hardcore body horror. This is a real deviation in a genre sense, even though it might fit tonally. But I hoped that the payoff would come at the end, where the knowledge you get during this X-Files episode just really adds to the final twist or the penultimate twist, I guess I'll say, because there's another twist in the epilogue.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it works very, very well. And I love that. I mean, like, when I got to that part of it where it's talking about the Knights, I was like, well, and the other thing too is, and I think that Teleportasm does this pretty consistently, is you're constantly being given things, like you said, you're upping the ante, like you get to these things that you're not expecting. So even though you're still being caught off guard, it still just makes sense to be caught off guard continuously because of the world that's building around this issue. Like as it spreads from this, like I said, from the main, the main smaller story to like, this is a much bigger thing. And I loved all of that. I was there for like all of it. I really was. And it's one of those things too, where like when you're watching, sometimes when you watch like mockumentary style films specifically, where they cover things in such a realistic way that you have to second guess what you've signed up for. And like the fake cover up thing and like just that whole kind of chunk of piece of that story, once you start going that direction, was very like, if I were watching a mockumentary about this, right, and that part came up, I would be like, well, like it'd have my wheels turning, to say the least.
Right. Awesome.
Yeah.
There we go. What what were some of the biggest challenges in terms of like the writing in general, the character arcs? Like, were there any particular, I mean, outside of like obviously adapting to like the series, but as far as like incorporating like those elements that we were just talking about, like what would you say maybe were some of the bigger humps to get over for yourself?
The humps I had to get over were kind of good humps in the sense that I think I had an abundance of riches. I think that I had so many ideas and tangents to explore that I would actually develop things to a almost completed extent that we ended up just kind of deciding we didn't need. There are at least 3 chapters that we just removed that we originally planned. Some of them were replaced. The chapter with Jasper and Ivy was actually the last chapter written.
Okay.
Even after the end and even the epilogue was written, I kind of went back, and the chapter that had been there was a much more straightforward account of the prank crew, the PMF crew. He's kind of like a jackass crew who harnesses teleportation for great gory pranks. It was a much more straightforward exploration of their antics, to the point that I thought it was too far removed and it was too scattered, and I wanted to keep that. I wanted to keep these characters in there, but I wanted to present it in a way that fit more with what Teleportasm had evolved into. Yeah. So, the humps were that, I would look back on chapters and be like, Teleportasm has gotten so good that good enough chapters all of a sudden weren't good enough anymore. I felt like every chapter had to deserve to be there. Not just, this is acceptable. Sure. It had to really belong there and add something. And So they were great hurdles to overcome. And I talked earlier about how the fact that my initial voice, maybe my natural voice, my primal voice, was a little bit too dark and introspective for the Killer VHS series. I love being able to just go down a new avenue. It's like maybe you're a musician and you've played heavy metal for 20 years, and now you just want to give hip hop a try. So you give hip hop a try. And it's just you can have fun with it because you're just trying something new, and it's a real liberating feeling. So initially being told that tone-wise I wasn't hitting the mark could be seen as a hump, and a challenge. But I really just took it the opposite way and said, okay, I'm going to make Alan so happy with this that, this whole process is going to be a joyful experience. And it was.
Wow.
Yeah. So you said there were 3 whole chapters. And so is there anything that not that you have to spoil anything for future projects, but were there any ideas from this particular novel that you would want to carry over?
I mean, absolutely. The chapters that I excised, the one I told you about, which was a much more straightforward account of the prank crew. There was a whole chapter about the prom that gets alluded to in chapter 2. Whereas if this kid lives long enough to make it to the prom, it's going to be a fucked up prom. Yeah, it was a fucked up prom. And then there was another one later on, which, I'm glad we excised because it would have kind of changed the mythology a little bit. I imagined this kind of terrorist incident where someone harnessed the sequence on the VHS tape to cause a plane crash, and very reminiscent of 9/11. And in that scenario, VHS tape was outlawed. So there was this whole like book burning metaphor, which was kind of apropos at the moment that I was writing it. But ultimately, it wouldn't have worked for the larger mythology. I didn't want to create a universe where VHS tape no longer exists after 2017, So I was kind of glad to have removed that one. But there are areas I would love to explore. I would love to do a part 2. And if we do, I'm going to bring Frankie back, man. I'm saying it right now. All right. I'm going to find a freaking way. I don't know how yet. It's going to have something to do with teleportation and point C. But I would love to bring Frankie back. Maybe the Frankie at the end of Teleportasm wasn't the real Frankie. I don't know.
Or something.
But, Frankie's got to come back and get some revenge on who.
Are we having some writer's remorse around Frankie?
I do, man. She didn't deserve it. She's the coolest character. Cool. Lars is kind of like based on me, or at least kind of is how I saw myself. When I was still kind of like an awkward dude in my late teens, early 20s. Yeah. Frankie, I just grew to like her more and more as I wrote her. And she's a combination of a few different friends. And so just thinking about not just the fact that, she didn't get to be a hero, but just the fact that she was just fucked up so royally, man. Yeah. It was like I felt really bad. Yeah, and I'd never felt that way before, I'd never felt bad for what I did to a fictional character before.
Oh, wow. Frankie's the first.
Frankie's the first.
Maybe there's teleport clones or something.
Who knows? I know. Plenty of tangents to go out on if I ever did another Teleportasm book, or maybe I'll just do a Teleportasm short story that'll get printed in an anthology somewhere that'll just fit into the universe but be more of a standalone.
Yeah. Right. I have like a quote I wanted to read, or at least if that's okay, that and then we can kind of talk about the end, and then we'll wrap up. But when this is one of those things, like I do try to write notes when, like I said earlier, when I'm reading stuff, so that I don't forget any things that I know that stood out. And when I read this section, I stopped to type it out because I knew I needed to say it. And obviously it's kind of a spoilery conversation. I don't think we've given too much away. I know we're probably going to wreck the ending, but
spoilers.
I think that this section though of this, like what I'm about to read, I think just was really encompassed everything that I went through with these characters that we met, and I just loved it so much. So I'm gonna, this is after the reveal of the fact that like there's things that see us when we're teleporting, and we get all of that information that kind of are just our breakdown of like, I know this now, right? And so Frankie says, I've seen things, electric sand dunes on a wind whipped wasteland, a place where planets groan in the inky night and stars scream, a place where black pyramids mock gravity, flying upside down in ominous squadrons. All of this and more beyond the quantum foam. And I was just like, Twilight Zone intro. Like, I loved that so much. And I literally stopped when I got to the end, when I got to foam, and I went back and I reread it. And I did that a couple of times because I loved, like, she's telling this story of like, this is like, you don't understand, right? This is the reality of what this is doing. And I loved that conversation between her and Lars. I loved that. But there's just something so scary about her saying that the way that she does. The black pyramids mock gravity. I was like, what the fuck? Yeah. So I just wanted to say, I loved the way that was written. It affected me deeply.
Thank you. I'm glad that that imagery really got to you, because it is kind of this like crazy moment. And at that point, the final reveal, the puppet master aspect hasn't quite been revealed yet.
Right.
But it's a little bit of a nod to Blade Runner when the final replicant is basically dying, in the rain, telling Decker about these things he's seen that the human mind doesn't even realize are beautiful. He's been a slave, but he's seen these things out in the universe that the human mind can't comprehend. So in a lot of ways, it was the same thing. And, just imagining this, alternate dimension, just allowing myself in this final moment to go complete Lovecraftian, underworld. It was a wonderful experience, and to kind of try to encapsulate cosmic dread, the immensity of cosmic dread in just a couple of colorful descriptions was a lot of fun. And I'm glad it resonated with you.
No, 100%. Like I said, I reread it. I was just like, I mean, there's definitely things, especially like the body horror. And like I mentioned the creatures and stuff earlier, but like when we're talking through these things and these events, there's plenty of things that got me where I was like, oh, like that sounds awful, or, oh, that makes me really uncomfortable, but like, that's like existential dread, like reading that and thinking about it in a realistic sense. Which, obviously the scene that we get with them and their sort of reunion, and then it takes us into, I really wanted to talk about this before we wrap up, which is the epilogue.
Okay.
Which is just another component of this that I was not prepared for. I was literally sitting there. I got to the epilogue and I was like, okay, what could this possibly say that it's going to be? And then I was literally like, I got to, I don't know, the third line in it. And I was like, you have got to be fucking kidding me. I was like, is this really happening? Am I really reading this right now? So essentially the framework being that this is in reality, changing things in our here and now. And I just was like, not enough coffee that day, but I just was like, oh my God, like what a creative full circle, oh my God, way to end this already insane journey.
Yeah, thanks. It was a way to kind of try to bring it into the real world, hinting at, Mandela effects and glitches in the Matrix and things like that. The epilogue, I kind of, wondered at first. I wasn't originally planning on doing an epilogue. I actually planned on having it just end with chapter 13 and leaving it to the reader to kind of put the pieces together and decide if the pieces even did fit together. But then I thought it would have more emotional impact to see that, almost nothing was random. Almost nothing was random. Even things that you thought maybe had nothing to do with anything, there was a thread going through it all.
What did you think, Steve, when you read that part? That it was like, basically, this is reality. These are really, like, these things are really happening.
I mean, it's like, well, so I think you said, Angel, is like, like the Twilight Zone's one of my favorite shows. So I just feel like it's up there with sort of these like scope out. I love like a big like scope out reveal. You kind of get like that Monsters Are Due on Maple Street kind of vibe, right? Yeah. Of just sort of like layer on layer. And I think the way you crafted it was so smart. on top of,
Smart.
and it was just sort of, it was a joy to read.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I love the way this wrapped up. And I will say, like, this was my first introduction to your writing. I haven't read anything else yet. This was my first thing. But I'm very intrigued to see, because as you mentioned, this kind of was led into a more fun kind of way, and like your normal voices. It makes me really interested to read the other stuff, because I think this is like insanely creative. And I think, like I mentioned before, checks a ton of boxes, which I don't know, like, I feel like indie horror is better at doing that than like mainstream horror, but I don't think it's always easy to do and make a cohesive story. And I think that this is super cohesive. It all made sense. It flowed really well. And I really enjoyed it. And thank you again for sending us e-copies to read it, because I really enjoyed it. It was a bananas ride. Like,
thank you. It's so much fun. I think I mentioned this before we started recording, but just having the opportunity to go on podcasts and to talk about it is so much fun for me. And I really appreciate it, having a chance to get into the weeds, pun intended, and, unwrap all my little surprises and Easter eggs. And I just really appreciate you guys. It's worth the wait to come on the show. And thank you so much for introducing your audience to me.
Yeah, of course. Your next project, hit us up. We'd love to have you back. This was a great conversation.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. For everybody watching, if you're not familiar with Joshua, all of his social media links will be in the description, as well as a link to where you can get a copy of Teleportasm. In case you couldn't tell, we really enjoyed it. It was a blast. If you're not familiar with the series and it's going to be the first installment, I think it will absolutely make you want to read the rest of them. So, well, cool. Well, we won't take up too much more of your time. Thank you, everybody. Oh, yeah, we had so much fun. I'm telling you, when I wrote my notes and we weren't able to record the last time, I was like, okay, I'm like, when we do get to, I have a lot I want to talk about. So it was good. But
I had a blast.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for hanging out with us on this episode of Horror Indie Author Interviews. We appreciate it. Make sure you check out Joshua. Get a copy of Teleportasm. Have a great rest of your week. Enjoy your weekend. And we will see you in the next one.